My name is Elaine Porter. I am 67, and yesterday my phone turned my home into a stranger. The sound that did it was small and ordinary, a soft ping from the kitchen counter while the kettle began to sing. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, thumbed the screen, and saw a new voice message from my daughter. The preview showed 3 seconds of waveform and her contact photo from years ago when she still sent me goofy selfies on Mother's Day. I pressed play, expecting a grocery request or a quick, "I love you." Instead, I heard a tone I had never heard from her in my direction, a clipped office voice she used on vendors. She said she could not keep me in her house any longer. She said I was taking over everything and that I would be better off in a place with round-the-clock care. She named a facility on the east side. She said she had already talked to the director. In the background, a man's voice, my son-in-law Mark, asked if the paperwork was ready. My name appeared in their sentences the way a piece of furniture appears in a moving checklist. My body reacted before my mind did. The kettle screamed and I forgot to lift it. The steam fogged my glasses. My heart thumped against the inside of my ribs like it wanted out. The message went on. Jenna spoke about numbers in her flat, practical way. Monthly fees, a deposit she had already paid, a plan to help me with decisions because I had been forgetful. She did not know she was talking to me. The message had been meant for him. She must have hit my name instead of his. My name sat there on the screen, glowing blue as if it had raised a hand. I leaned on the counter and closed my eyes. The house smelled like toast and lemon cleaner. Outside, a school bus wheezed to a stop and a child laughed. The world had the nerve to continue. I set the kettle aside and pressed play again because I did not trust my own ears. The second time through, I noticed the smaller things. The clink of a mug on their table, the muted buzz of a television. The way Jenna lowered her voice when she said my first and last name, as if speaking to a doctor. She said she had asked her cousin Kayla, who works at the county office, to help make the transfer of title smooth. She said it would be better if I did not worry about bills anymore. She said I would thank them later. I did not cry. Not yet. I slid the phone face down and watched sunlight crawl across the floorboards my husband laid in our better years. The light reached an old scratch from when Jenna dropped a mixing bowl at 15, and we both laughed and ate cupcakes from the ruined batter. Memory rose like warm air, and it almost took me under. I gripped the edge of the counter until my fingertips hurt. In the next room, the mantel clock chimed 9 times, and I felt every single year of my life at once. The early mornings, the dentist waiting rooms, the double shifts, the birthday candles, the casseroles in foil, the winter heat bills, the heavy moments I carried without asking anyone to lift with me. When the message ended, my phone returned to silence. I flipped it over and watched the waveform sit there as proof. My first thought was plain and sharp. They think I am alone. They think I will nod, sign, and disappear into soft lighting and corporate music. They think I do not understand forms. They think I will trade my name for their convenience. My second thought surprised me with how calm it was. I know where my papers are. I know who still answers a landline. I know which banker has known me for 20 years by the sound of my step. I took 1 breath in and 1 breath out. I unplugged the kettle and poured the hot water down the sink. I turned the phone to airplane mode, as if I were hanging a do not disturb sign on my own life. Then I walked down the hall to my room and opened the cedar chest at the foot of my bed. The scent of cedar rose up like a forest after rain. Under quilts and photo albums lay a folder with my passport, my deed, my insurance, and a list of numbers in my handwriting, steady and dark. I laid everything out on the bed as if setting a table for company. In the mirror, I still looked like myself. The silver along my hairline caught the light. My mouth knew how to hold its shape even when my heart misfired. I opened the closet and reached for the cherry red coat I wore the day Jenna graduated. The fabric felt like purpose. I set it across the chair, chose a clean blouse, and lined up my shoes with the habit of someone who has stood on her own 2 feet for decades. The coat gleamed in the morning sun like a signal flare. I did not feel old. I felt awake. I gathered my documents into a leather binder, slid my phone into my bag, and placed my keys next to it. Before I left the kitchen, I took out a notepad and wrote a sentence, simple and clear. Running errands in the morning. Back later. Love, Mom. My handwriting looked like my mother's. I folded the note and set it against the sugar jar where anyone with eyes could see truth written down. The house listened as I locked the door behind me. The air tasted like cold and a new beginning. The sky over our little street held the pale blue of cautious hope. I walked to the car, started the engine, and watched the reflection of that red coat settle across my shoulders. The first stop would be the bank. The second would be the county building. There would be more after that. By noon, I intended to place my name back into my own hands. I wasn't always this hardened woman in a crimson suit. The truth is, my life had been a long chain of sacrifices, each one linked to the next, all for Grace. I grew up in a 2-bedroom duplex in Cleveland, the kind with thin walls where you could hear your neighbors argue through the night and smell their cooking through the vents. My mother, Lillian, was the kind of woman who believed family wasn't something you spoke about, it was something you proved through sacrifice. She worked as a seamstress, from dawn until midnight, her fingers cracked and calloused from decades of needle and thread. I would fall asleep to the soft, rhythmic scrape of her scissors on fabric, and I'd wake to the faint hum of her old Singer machine. "Margaret," she would tell me, adjusting her glasses as she taught me to sew crooked lines on scraps of fabric. "Family is blood, but blood means nothing if you don't honor it. You give until it hurts. That's love." At 16, I thought I knew what love meant. I thought it was the boy who promised me forever under the bleachers after football practice, whispering about a life together in the city. But forever lasted only until the pregnancy test turned positive. When I told him, he vanished faster than smoke in the wind. His parents slammed the door in my face and told me he had a future to protect, and I wasn't part of it. I remember standing in the freezing Ohio winter, the snow soaking through my shoes, my hands trembling around the tiny test in my pocket. I had never felt so abandoned. But my mother didn't hesitate. She sold her only jewelry, 2 thin gold bracelets she had inherited from her own mother, and handed me the cash. "This baby will have everything you didn't. We'll raise her together." When Grace was born, she was tiny but fierce, with lungs that could shake the house. The first time she wrapped her little fingers around mine, I swore nothing would ever harm her. I was 19 when I started cleaning houses. Back then, I earned just $30 a day, scrubbing floors, polishing silver I would never own, folding linen softer than anything in my home. My knees ached, my hands cracked, but I carried a picture of Grace in my pocket. Each time I wanted to collapse, I would pull it out, look at her round cheeks and gummy smile, and keep going. I'll never forget the first time I walked her to kindergarten. We didn't have money for the bus, so we walked the 2 miles in the fall, chill. Her uniform was secondhand, but I had ironed it crisp, her shoes polished until they shone. The other mothers pulled up in shiny SUVs, stepping out in heels, manicured and perfumed. I stood in my patched winter coat, my palms rough from bleach water, feeling so small I wanted to vanish. But then, Grace kissed my cheek and whispered, "Thank you, Mama. You're the best in the world." In that moment, every humiliation was worth it. Life became a rhythm of sacrifice. Up before dawn to make her breakfast. 3 houses to clean before picking her up at school. Evenings spent helping with homework at the kitchen table while my body screamed for rest. On weekends, I took extra laundry jobs, pressing other people's clothes so my daughter could one day wear gowns of her own. When Grace was 8, my mother died suddenly from a stroke. Her last words to me still echo in my ears. "That child is your treasure. Raise her right, and she will take care of you when you're old." I clung to those words as my lifeline. They gave me strength to work harder, to sacrifice more, to believe my daughter would grow up grateful. I put every ounce of myself into Grace. Each dollar earned, each hour stolen from my own youth, each dream I deferred, all of it, I laid at her feet. What I didn't know then was that sacrifice, without boundaries, can become a cage. And sometimes the people you give everything to will take and take until there's nothing left but resentment. By the time Grace turned 12, sacrifice was already the language of my life. Every cent I earned belonged to her future. I wore the same pair of shoes for 3 winters, patching the soles with duct tape, while she had a new pair of polished Mary Janes for choir recitals. I told myself it was worth it each time her teachers praised her as bright, diligent, a child destined for more than her mother's mop and bucket. At 15, Grace's classmates were talking about sweet 16 parties in banquet halls with chocolate fountains and DJs. I couldn't afford extravagance, but I refused to let my daughter feel small. For 6 months, I worked extra houses on Sundays, my only day off, so she could have a quinceañera-style party she'd never forget. I spent $4,000 I had been saving to repair our leaking roof. That night, she twirled across the rented ballroom in a golden dress, eyes shining as her friends cheered. When she hugged me afterward and whispered, "Mama, when I grow up, I'll give all of this back to you, 1,000 times more," my tired body melted into tears of joy. College was the mountain I dreaded, but never doubted we'd climb. Tuition at the state university was $18,000 a year. On paper, my income made it impossible. But mothers don't live on paper. I took out loans against the house, sold my engagement ring, and even parted with my mother's old sewing machine, the last heirloom she left me. "You'll have what I never had," I told Grace the day we signed her enrollment forms. She beamed at me in the admissions office, clutching her schedule like a golden ticket. Those years nearly broke me. 4 jobs, sometimes working through the night. I ironed strangers' clothes at a dry cleaner until my wrists ached. I cooked at a diner on weekends, wiping grease off my apron before running to clean someone's vacation rental. I ate beans and rice so Grace could buy thick textbooks and business suits for her presentations. I told myself it was temporary, that once she graduated, the tide would turn. The day Grace walked across the stage in her cap and gown, I thought my heart might burst. The auditorium smelled like carnations and fresh ink from printed diplomas. I clapped until my palms stung, tears blurring my vision as they called her name. She hugged me afterward, crying into my shoulder. "Mom, this is ours. You'll never suffer again." Those words were the sweetest payment I thought I'd ever receive. Soon after, she met Daniel at her new job. He was steady, polite, a man who looked me in the eye when he shook my hand. For a while, I believed he was the partner she deserved. When they announced their engagement, Grace begged for the kind of wedding she had seen in magazines, an elegant affair with crystal centerpieces and a live band. The cost made my chest tighten. $12,000. I borrowed from neighbors, sold the last of my jewelry, and even dipped into the tiny emergency fund I had tucked away for medical bills. The wedding was beautiful. Grace glowed in lace, Daniel looked proud, and guests whispered how magical the evening was. No one knew that I had stayed up all night sewing table runners by hand to cut costs. As I watched her dance under fairy lights, I whispered a prayer that all of it, every sacrifice, every dollar, every hour of my life would finally be repaid in love, in gratitude, in care. For a while, I believed it might be. In their first years of marriage, Grace and Daniel visited me every Sunday for dinner. She'd bring groceries, slip a little money into my purse, and say, "Now it's my turn to care for you." I thought my mother's prophecy had come true. That sacrifice had finally blossomed into security. But life has a cruel way of shifting. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, those Sunday dinners grew less frequent. Excuses piled up, missed calls became common. And the gratitude that once lit her eyes began to flicker and fade. At first, Daniel seemed like a blessing. He had a decent job as a supervisor at a packaging plant, and he treated Grace with respect. They came for Sunday dinners with laughter in their voices, carrying grocery bags or flowers. For a little while, I let myself believe my sacrifices had finally carved out a stable future for my daughter. She looked settled, happy, and proud to show her new life to me. But stability has a fragile backbone. 3 years into their marriage, Daniel lost his job. He tried to hide it at first, but the tension was written on his face when they came by. Grace eventually asked me for help. "Mom, it's just a rough patch. Can you cover a few bills until we're back on our feet?" Of course I said yes. That was the beginning of a slippery slope. It started with $1,000 for their rent. Then $2,500 for a down payment on a new car because Daniel said he needed something reliable to apply for better jobs. A few months later, it was $3,000 to pay off credit card debt. I told myself it was temporary, the same way I always had. After all, hadn't my mother given until her last breath to keep us afloat? But something shifted in those years. Gratitude was replaced with expectation. When I hesitated before transferring money, Grace would sigh and remind me of everything I had always promised her. "Mom, you said you'd always be there for me. Don't start changing now." Her words carried weight, but her eyes didn't carry warmth anymore. Small cracks widened. They began missing Sunday dinners, saying Daniel's new job required late hours. When I called in the mornings, Grace claimed she was in meetings. In the afternoons, she was at the store. At night, she was too tired. Conversations that once stretched into laughter dwindled to 5-minute check-ins, if that. One spring afternoon, determined to surprise them, I baked Daniel's favorite pineapple upside-down cake and drove to their house unannounced. I rang the bell and heard muffled voices inside. It took nearly 5 minutes before Grace opened the door, her smile forced and thin. Behind her, Daniel's cousin Kayla sat at the kitchen table with a stack of documents, shoving them into a folder as soon as she saw me. "What's all this?" I asked, forcing lightness into my voice. "Oh, just insurance paperwork for Daniel," Grace answered too quickly. Kayla gave me the kind of tight smile that never reached the eyes. I caught a glimpse of my name on one of those pages before it disappeared into the folder. My chest tightened. When I pressed further, Grace changed the subject with unnatural swiftness. "Mom, tell me about your garden. Did those tulips ever bloom?" It was subtle at first, but the red flags grew louder. Missed invitations, whispers that died the moment I walked into a room. And then came the comments disguised as concern. "Mom, Daniel says you've been forgetting things lately," Grace said one day over the phone. "Are you sure you can handle living alone in that big house?" I laughed nervously, brushing it off, but the words cut deep. Forgetful? I still managed my bills, cooked my meals, kept my routines. Was this just worry, or something more deliberate? A few weeks later, they invited me to lunch at a restaurant across town. I showed up at the time we'd agreed, but the hostess told me no reservation had been made. I sat alone for an hour, only to get a text later. "Sorry, Mom, emergency at work. We'll reschedule." It happened 3 more times in 2 months. Each time I felt smaller, like a burden they were trying to misplace. The final straw came when Grace told me, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "Mom, maybe it's time to think about other living arrangements. You shouldn't be alone in that big house." She framed it as concern, but I could hear the calculation beneath her words. The house, my house, was the one thing I had built brick by brick over 30 years of sweat and sacrifice. And for the first time, I realized it wasn't just me they were trying to push aside. It was my home, my independence, my dignity. The unease that had been scratching at the back of my mind finally took shape when I began noticing the numbers. I have always kept careful notebooks of my bills, water, gas, property taxes written in my neat handwriting with the dates circled in red ink. Lately, though, things didn't add up. Payments I didn't remember authorizing appeared in my bank records. Transactions I didn't make carried my name. At first I thought it was a clerical mistake, maybe the bank's system glitching. But then I saw Grace at the kitchen table one Sunday, flipping through my mail like it belonged to her. When I asked why, she smiled too quickly and said, "Just trying to help you, Mom. At your age, these forms can get confusing." Her words stung. I'd balanced accounts since she was in diapers. But I said nothing, swallowing my discomfort, because mothers don't accuse daughters lightly. It wasn't just the mail. Daniel began poking around the house with his sharp little comments. "This TV's outdated," he said, remote in hand. "And the internet's too slow. Do you even know what you're paying for, Elaine? Maybe we should take care of it." His tone was casual, but his eyes were measuring the walls as if the house already belonged to him. Then came the real request. Grace called one Tuesday evening, her voice unusually sweet. "Mom, Daniel and I need a little help. Just for this month. His hours got cut, and you know how expensive everything's gotten. Could you transfer us $1,500? We'll pay you back." It was never just once. The first request bled into the second, then the third. $1,500 for expenses. $2,000 for a car repair. $2,700 to clear a credit card. Each time she promised it was temporary. Each time I reminded myself that family takes care of family. But receipts don't lie. When I sat at my kitchen table late one night, flipping through my notebook, I saw the truth. In the last 18 months, I had given them over $25,000. My pension checks were thinning, my savings almost gone. Meanwhile, Grace and Daniel remodeled their kitchen with granite counters and stainless steel appliances. They bragged about their European-style vacation on social media while I patched leaks in my roof with tar I bought on clearance. One afternoon, I decided to stop by their place unannounced. I carried a pineapple upside-down cake in my hands, the same dessert Daniel once claimed was his favorite. As I walked into the living room, I caught sight of Kayla again, the cousin from the county clerk's office. Papers were spread across the table. She flinched when she saw me, shoving documents into a folder. "What's going on here?" I asked. "Insurance updates?" Grace said smoothly, standing a little too quickly. "You know how complicated these things are." But I had glimpsed my own name printed in bold letters before the folder snapped shut. My pulse hammered. After that day, the signs became impossible to ignore. Grace offered to help with my utility bills, insisting I let her handle the payments online. Soon she was combing through my bank statements, making little comments like, "Mom, why do you need this much cash?" Daniel suggested I stop driving because, at your age, accidents happen. They began to speak over me when I asked questions, as if I were a child interrupting adult business. The whispers, the paperwork, the slow tightening of control, it all formed a picture I didn't want to see. And yet, deep down, I knew. One evening, while trimming the roses in my front yard, I overheard Daniel's voice through the open window. "Don't worry. Carol says the transfer will be ready in 2 weeks. She's handling the deed." My hands froze around the clippers. The deed. My house. The roses blurred in front of me. I gripped the bush so tightly that thorns pierced my palms, but I barely felt the sting. They weren't just borrowing money anymore. They were laying the groundwork to take the only thing I truly owned. The thought made me dizzy. This house wasn't just wood and bricks. It was the place where I rocked Grace to sleep, where I marked her height on the kitchen doorway, where every corner held a memory of sacrifice and love. And now, the daughter I had given everything to was plotting to erase me from it. That night I couldn't sleep. I paced the house, running my hand along the walls I had painted myself, the cabinets I had scrubbed until they shone. My notebook of accounts lay open on the kitchen table, page after page of careful numbers. I saw every check I had written, every transfer I had made, every dollar that had left my hands and gone into theirs. It was all there in black and white, the proof of my devotion and the proof of their betrayal. It was a Tuesday afternoon, quiet except for the tick of the mantel clock and the kettle humming on the stove. I was steeping chamomile tea, trying to calm the knot of unease that had been living in my chest, when my phone chimed with a new message. The screen lit up with Grace's name. For a fleeting second, I thought maybe she was inviting me to dinner. Maybe she'd remembered the little traditions we used to share. I pressed play, and the world tilted. "Mark, I can't stand having my mother in this house anymore." Grace's voice burst through the speaker, sharp, impatient, stripped of the warmth I had once thought eternal. She gets into everything. She questions every decision. And on top of it, we're spending so much on her already. I found a facility out on the east side, $800 a month. It'll be easier once she's out of the way. The mug slipped from my hands and shattered on the linoleum. Her voice kept going, steady and cold. Kayla already checked the deed. Yes, it's in her name. But she showed me how to transfer it without her even realizing. It'll cost some fees, maybe $500 in bribes, but it's worth it. Once it's done, we'll finally live in peace without that bitter old woman controlling us. My knees buckled, and I gripped the counter to stay upright. The words, bitter old woman, clawed through me harder than any insult I had ever endured. And then I heard Daniel's laugh, low and approving. Grace's tone softened into amusement. In a month, she'll be in a home, and we'll own everything. We can pay off the cards, redo the kitchen, even plan that trip to Italy. Honestly, Mark, she still thanks us for breakfast in bed. If only she knew I'm keeping her calm while we prepare her funeral in life. Funeral in life. I sank to the floor, the phone pressed to my ear, my body trembling as though it had turned to glass. My mind scrambled for another explanation. Maybe it was a cruel joke. Maybe I had misheard. But the laughter in the background was real. The casual mention of bribes was real. The plan to erase me from my own home, my own life, was real. The message ended with Grace's voice, cool and triumphant. In a month, Mom will be gone, and we'll finally be free. I sat there for what felt like hours, the shards of the broken mug scattered around me, chamomile tea seeping into the floorboards. Every sacrifice, every night I had scrubbed houses until my knuckles bled, every dollar I had poured into her future, every promise she had made to take care of me, all of it shattered in that moment. But then, something inside me shifted. The tears dried on my cheeks, replaced by a sharpness I hadn't felt in years. The betrayal was deep, but deeper still was the clarity that followed. My daughter thought I was weak. She thought age had dulled my mind. She thought she could strip me of my dignity and discard me like a piece of old furniture. She was wrong. At dawn, I rose with a resolve that straightened my spine and steadied my hands. I pulled the crimson suit from the back of my closet, the one I had worn the day Grace graduated from college. The fabric glowed like a flame in the morning light, a reminder of who I was when I still believed in hope. I set it carefully on the chair, polished my shoes, and gathered my documents. The deed, my insurance, my bank statements, all the proof that I was still the keeper of my own life. I wrote a short note and left it on the kitchen table. Running errands. Back later. Love, Mom. No explanations. No details. They didn't deserve them. As the sun rose, I locked the door behind me, the key cool in my palm. For the first time in months, I wasn't leaving as a burden. I was leaving as a woman with a plan. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of dew and cut grass as I walked toward the bank. My heart pounded, but not from fear, from purpose. I had spent decades rushing to jobs for other people, cleaning their kitchens, folding their clothes, polishing their floors. Today, I was finally doing something for myself. The bank lobby was quiet, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Behind the counter stood Nora, the branch manager who had known me for more than 15 years. She looked up, surprised, then smiled warmly. "Good morning, Miss Elaine. We don't see you this early. What can I do for you today?" I straightened my shoulders. "Nora, I need to review all the transactions on my account for the past 6 months. And I need to change my beneficiaries immediately." My voice was steady, sharper than I expected, and I saw her brows lift at my tone. She led me to her office, the smell of fresh coffee lingering in the air. As she clicked through the computer, her expression darkened. "There have been several inquiries into your accounts," she said carefully. "According to the file, your daughter Grace presented a signed authorization from you to access your statements." My stomach dropped, but my voice came out firm. "I never signed any authorization." Nora turned the screen toward me. There it was, a document with my name scrawled at the bottom, the letters bent and leaning in ways I never wrote them. The forgery was close, but not close enough. My throat tightened. "That's not my signature. Look here, I've never made my E like that." Her eyes widened. "This is fraud, Miss Elaine." The word rang in the air. Fraud. My own daughter's name tied to a crime against me. I forced myself to keep breathing. I want every access she has canceled today. Freeze any linked authorizations. From now on, this account belongs only to me. Nora nodded quickly, typing commands with urgency. "Of course. We'll also put a fraud alert on the account. I'll need you to file a report, but first let's secure your assets." For the next hour, we went line by line. I transferred my savings just over $9,200 into a brand new account, one Grace didn't know existed. I updated my life insurance beneficiary, erasing her name entirely and replacing it with a senior foundation that cared for abandoned elders. If Grace thought she was inheriting my future, she was in for a shock. By the time we finished, I felt taller, lighter, as if I'd shed a skin I no longer needed. Nora looked at me with quiet respect. "You're doing the right thing. Too many of our elderly clients get taken advantage of by family. Most never fight back." I clasped her hand. "Thank you, Nora, but I'm not done yet. I have one more stop to make." I tucked the new account documents into my purse, the papers crisp against my fingers. Walking out of the bank, the autumn sun warmed my face. For the first time in months, the knot in my chest loosened. Grace thought I would crumble quietly, that I would go wherever she pushed me. But she had underestimated the woman who had built a life from nothing. Next stop, the county clerk's office, where Kayla sat at her desk, thinking her schemes were hidden behind official seals and forms. She was about to learn that I wasn't the naive mother they imagined. The county clerk's office smelled faintly of paper and toner, the air heavy with the quiet rustle of files being shuffled from one desk to another. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a pale glow on rows of counters where clerks sat hunched over forms. I walked in wearing my crimson suit, head high, purse clutched tightly under my arm. A few people looked up, but most were too busy with their paperwork to notice me. My heels clicked against the linoleum floor, echoing like a metronome guiding me straight to Kayla's desk. She looked up, startled. Her hands, already clutching a stack of documents, froze in place. "Aunt Elaine, I didn't know you were coming." I gave her a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "That's the point. I'm here to check on my property file. My daughter mentioned you were helping with some papers." Her face drained of color. "Oh, well, yes, just routine updates." She began shuffling the documents nervously, sliding one folder half under another. I sat down across from her, laying my purse on the counter, and leaned in slightly. "Kayla, let's not waste time. I know about the forged authorization at the bank. I know about the deed transfer you've been planning with Grace. And I know you've been using your position here to move things along quietly." Her breath caught. She forced a laugh, thin and brittle. "Aunt, I think you're confused. We would never—" Before she could finish, I pulled out my phone and pressed play. Grace's voice filled the small space, cold and unflinching. "Kayla already checked the deed. Yes, it's in her name, but she showed me how to transfer it without her even realizing. It'll cost some fees, maybe $500 in bribes, but it's worth it." Kayla's eyes went wide. Her hands trembled so violently that the pen she was holding clattered onto the desk. I let the silence stretch before speaking again. "Now, you have two choices. You help me undo every single fraudulent step you've taken, or I walk straight to your supervisor with this recording. And when I'm done there, I'll take it to the police. You'll lose your job, your reputation, and maybe even your freedom." Tears welled in her eyes. "Please, Aunt Elaine, I didn't want to do it." Grace begged me. "She said you were getting too old to handle things. She promised me $2,000 once the transfer was complete. I swear I didn't think it would go this far." I kept my expression cold. "Money was worth more to you than family? Than honesty? Don't insult me with excuses. You chose to sign your name to lies, and now you'll choose how this ends." Kayla broke then. Shoulders sagging, she pulled open a drawer and took out a thick folder. "These are the documents we started. The draft deed transfer, the medical reports, everything Grace wanted. If you want, I can void them all right now. And I can give you copies, proof of what they tried to do." "Do it," I said firmly. For the next 2 hours, I watched her invalidate every false record. She stamped forms void, crossed out forged signatures, and opened digital files to erase fraudulent entries. Her hands never stopped trembling. Finally, she slid the copies toward me. "This is everything. Please, don't tell my boss. I'll resign quietly. Just let me keep my children fed." I picked up the folder, my fingers steady on the papers that proved their betrayal. For a moment, I considered her plea. She looked small, broken, almost pitiful. But then I remembered her signature on those lies, the way she smiled at me when she thought I was too blind to see. "You'll resign," I said. "You'll walk away from this job before I change my mind. If you help me now, I won't press charges against you. But if I see even one more false document with my name on it, I won't hesitate." She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. I stood, clutching the evidence close to my chest. "You thought I wouldn't fight back. You thought I was just an old woman too tired to notice. But you underestimated me, Kayla. You all did." As I walked out of the clerk's office, the autumn wind caught my hair and the folder pressed firm against my ribs. The first battle was won, but the war was only beginning. With Kayla's folder of evidence pressed against my inside, I walked straight from the county clerk's office to a lawyer's building downtown. The glass doors reflected my crimson suit, and for the first time in years, I liked the woman I saw looking back. Strong, determined, no longer a silent victim. Inside, the receptionist spoke in a polished voice. "Good morning. Do you have an appointment?" "I need to see an attorney today," I said, steady and unwavering. "It's urgent. I've uncovered fraud against me by family members." Her eyebrows flicked upward at the word fraud. Within minutes, I was sitting in a private office with Attorney Harris, a silver-haired man known in town for his tenacity in elder protection cases. The shelves behind him were lined with thick legal volumes and framed certificates, but what struck me most was the calm intensity in his eyes as he listened. I laid everything on his desk, my notebooks of bank transfers, the forged authorization form Nora had shown me, Kayla's voided documents, and my phone with Grace's damning voicemail queued and ready. "They tried to take my house. They stole from my accounts. They're building a false case to have me declared incompetent." He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "Miss Elaine, what you have here is a textbook case of elder financial abuse, fraud, forgery, conspiracy. It's serious, very serious. If we pursue this, it won't just stop your daughter and son-in-law. It could trigger a full investigation into everyone involved." I felt a pang in my chest at the word daughter, but I forced myself not to flinch. "Do whatever you need to. I'm done being afraid." For hours we combed through the evidence. Harris asked precise questions, never once doubting my memory or dismissing my words. He pointed out the patterns: unauthorized withdrawals totaling over $25,000, signed forms with clear discrepancies, medical reports listing symptoms I never had. "They were building a paper trail to have you institutionalized," he said grimly. "Once inside, you'd lose access to your accounts, your property, your independence. They would control everything." The thought made my stomach twist, but at the same time, relief washed over me. I hadn't been paranoid. I hadn't been imagining the whispers, the lies, the strange visits from so-called specialists. It was real, and now it was documented. Harris began drafting a strategy. "First, we'll file for immediate protective orders on your property and accounts. That freezes any attempts at transfer. Second, we'll prepare a civil lawsuit for fraud, forgery, and exploitation. Third, we'll file a criminal complaint with the district attorney's office. The recordings, especially your daughter's voicemail, are dynamite evidence. No jury will ignore it." He looked up at me. "But I need to know, Miss Elaine, what outcome do you want? Justice in court? Financial restitution? Or are you seeking something more personal?" I thought of Grace's voice on that recording, dripping with contempt, speaking of me like I was an obstacle to be removed. My throat tightened. I want justice. And I want her to understand that what she did has consequences. For 35 years, I gave her everything. Now she needs to face what she's become. Harris nodded. "Then that's what we'll pursue." He slid the folder back toward me, now neatly organized with legal tabs. "Keep these safe. Tomorrow morning, I'll file the initial motions. And when we're ready, we'll confront them face to face with the truth." I walked out of his office as the sun was setting, its orange light spilling across the sidewalk. For months I had lived with fear gnawing at me, but now the fear had transformed into fire. The evidence was in my hands, the law was on my side, and for the first time since Grace's betrayal began, I felt the ground solid beneath my feet. That night, I slept soundly, my documents tucked in a locked drawer by my bed. The storm was coming, and this time I would be the one holding the thunder. The next morning dawned cool and clear, the kind of day that would have been perfect for gardening if my life hadn't been unraveling. At 10 sharp, the doorbell rang. My pulse raced as I opened it to see Attorney Harris, 2 uniformed officers, and a notary standing together on my porch. Harris gave me a small nod. "It's time." Inside, Grace and Daniel were sprawled on the couch watching television, their laughter clashing with the heavy silence that followed the arrival of my guests. Grace's smile froze when she saw the officers. Daniel's face tightened, his jaw working as if he'd just bitten into something bitter. "Mom, what's going on?" Grace asked, her voice faltering. I closed the door firmly behind us and stood tall, the crimson suit hugging my frame like armor. "Sit down. It's time you both hear the truth." The attorney stepped forward, his briefcase clicking open. Grace Miller, Daniel Miller, this meeting concerns documented fraud, forgery, and attempted exploitation of Miss Elaine Miller. We have gathered irrefutable evidence. Grace's skin turned pale, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Daniel tried to hold on to his composure, but I saw the flicker of panic in his eyes. Fraud? That's ridiculous, Grace stammered. Mom asked us to help with her accounts. She forgets things. Enough, I interrupted, my voice sharper than I thought possible. I pulled out my phone and pressed play. Grace's voice filled the room, cold and damning. Mark, I can't stand having my mother in this house anymore. Kayla already checked the deed. In a month, she'll be in a home and will own everything. The color drained completely from her face. Daniel cursed under his breath. One of the officers shifted, arms crossed, as if bracing for what might come next. That's private, Grace snapped, lunging toward me. But the officer stepped between us, holding her back with a firm hand. Attorney Harris laid a series of documents on the coffee table, each page sliding down like a hammer. Here are the forged bank authorizations. Here are the voided deed transfer drafts your cousin Kayla provided, along with her signed confession. And here are the falsified medical reports claiming your mother suffered from dementia, directly contradicted by yesterday's official evaluation declaring her fully competent. Grace's lips trembled. Kayla lied. She's trying to save herself. I cut her off again, producing the small recorder from my purse. Kayla's voice spilled out in tears. Grace told me you couldn't take care of yourself. She showed me how to forge your signature. She promised me money if I helped. Daniel's composure cracked. He dropped his head into his hands, muttering, "This is a nightmare." "No, Daniel," I said, standing taller than I ever had. "A nightmare is what you tried to put me through, trapped in a home, stripped of my dignity, my life's work stolen from me. This is justice." Attorney Harris spoke firmly, addressing the officers. As of today, protective orders are in place for Miss Miller's property and accounts. We are also filing civil and criminal charges. These individuals will be held accountable. Grace finally broke, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mom, please. We didn't mean we were desperate. The bills were piling up. You wanted my house," I said flatly. "You wanted my death to be convenient. Don't call it desperation. Call it what it is, betrayal." The room went silent. Even the television, still flickering faintly in the background, seemed muted under the weight of truth. The officers exchanged a look and stepped forward. "Ma'am, do you want us to proceed with arrests today?" I stared at Grace, my daughter who had once clung to me in kindergarten, whispering that I was the best mom in the world. For a split second, grief cut through the armor I'd built. But then I remembered her laughter on that voicemail, her calculation as she plotted to erase me. "Yes," I said. My voice didn't waver. "Proceed." The clink of handcuffs echoed through the living room as Grace cried out, "Mom, please, you can't do this, I'm your daughter." But I had already turned away, my gaze fixed on the window where sunlight streamed through, warm and steady. For the first time in months, I felt free. The house was silent after the officers led Grace and Daniel away. For the first time in months, I could walk through my own rooms without hearing whispers cut short or feeling eyes follow me. But peace was short-lived. Betrayal does not end when the door closes. It morphs, spreads, and tries to claw its way back. 2 days later, my neighbor Miss Rose knocked on my door, her face pale. "Elaine, honey, are you all right? I saw some awful things online." I frowned. "What things?" She handed me her phone. There, on a community Facebook group, a profile under Grace's name had posted, "My mother is losing her mind. She's been confused, violent, accusing us of stealing. We tried to help her, but she's turning neighbors against us. If you see her wandering alone, please call me. She shouldn't be unsupervised." The post was accompanied by a picture of me sitting on my porch, snapped without my knowledge. My hair was messy, my eyes tired from weeks of stress. Strangers had flooded the comments with pity and judgment. Poor woman, clearly dementia. Those poor kids taking care of her. I felt sick. Grace hadn't just tried to take my house now, she was trying to erase my credibility. That night, the phone calls began. Unknown numbers rang at every hour. Some voices hurled insults. "You ungrateful old hag." Others whispered threats, "Drop the charges, or you'll regret it." At 3 in the morning, a female voice screamed through the line, "You'll die alone, Elaine. That's what you deserve." I unplugged the phone, but the harassment seeped into every corner of my life. Flyers appeared in my mailbox claiming I was senile. Strangers showed up at my door pretending to be social workers. One even tried to step inside without permission until I slammed the door in his face. Attorney Harris warned me during our next meeting. "They're trying to build a false narrative, discredit you, so that if this goes to trial, the jury doubts your story. This tactic is common in financial exploitation cases, but with your recordings, documents, and witnesses, their efforts won't hold." Still, the campaign hurt. Letters arrived in my mailbox, written in a cruel, anonymous hand. "You worked like a servant your whole life for nothing. No wonder your daughter hates you." Another said, "No one will care when you're gone." One evening, I sat on the kitchen floor, those letters scattered around me, sobbing harder than I had since my mother's funeral. I whispered into the empty room, "What did I do wrong? How did I raise a child who could hate me this much?" But then I remembered my mother's words, written in her last letter to me. "Don't allow anyone, not even your own daughter, to trample on your dignity." Her voice rose in my memory, steady and strong, and I wiped my tears with shaking hands. Grace's cruelty wasn't my failure, it was her choice. The next morning, I met with Harris again. "I want every letter, every post, every call documented. If they want to smear me, fine, but I'll turn their poison into proof." He nodded, impressed. "That determination is exactly what will win this case." From then on, I began collecting the evidence. Screenshots of Facebook posts, recordings of threatening voicemails, photographs of the letters. Each item went into a growing file, thick with their malice. What they meant as intimidation became the very rope they were hanging themselves with. Still, I could not ignore the ache of betrayal. At night, when the house fell quiet, I would hold that file in my lap and whisper to the empty rooms, "I gave you everything, Grace, and now you're trying to destroy me." But I wasn't destroyed. Not yet. And the more they pushed, the more determined I became to see justice done not just privately, but publicly, where everyone who once believed their lies would see the truth. The harassment wore me down like waves against stone. Day after day, I held my head up for the neighbors, but at night the walls seemed to close in. I stopped answering the phone. I avoided the grocery store. Every time I saw people whispering in the produce aisle, I wondered if they had read Grace's posts painting me as a senile old woman. One night, after receiving yet another anonymous letter, this one saying, "Your daughter hates you because you're impossible to love," I crumpled onto the kitchen floor. The same floor where I had first listened to Grace's damning voicemail. I clutched the paper in my fists, rocking back and forth, asking myself, what did I do wrong? How could my own child despise me like this? My chest ached with a pain deeper than betrayal, the suspicion that maybe the cruel words were right, that maybe my love had somehow failed. It was then I remembered a small cedar box tucked in the back of my closet. My mother's box, the one where she kept her treasures, an embroidered handkerchief, a rosary missing a bead, a few yellowed letters she had written me long ago. My hands shook as I opened it, searching for the one I had not read in years. There it was, a folded piece of paper, my name scrawled in her shaky handwriting. "My dearest Elaine," it began. "If you are reading this, it is because I am no longer with you. I want you to know how proud I am of the woman and mother you have become. You raised Grace with more love and sacrifice than I ever imagined possible. But if ever in life someone tries to trample on your dignity, remember this: true love never seeks to destroy. True love respects, protects, and cherishes. Do not allow anyone, even your own child, to strip away your worth. You deserve peace, you deserve respect. And if someone cannot give you that, they do not deserve your place in their life." Tears blurred the ink. I pressed the letter to my chest, as if my mother's voice could seep into me through the paper. She had known, even then, that life could twist cruelly, that sacrifice did not guarantee loyalty. She had written me the strength I would one day need. I sat there until dawn, the first rays of light spilling across the worn kitchen tiles. By the time the sun rose, something inside me had hardened, not bitterness, but resolve. My mother's words had become my compass. The next morning, I called Attorney Harris. My voice was steady. I want to proceed with all charges, every single one. I won't drop anything. They need to face the full weight of the law. There was a pause on the other end, then his calm reply, "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. Because I have news, Grace and Daniel are already trying to negotiate a settlement. They want this case to disappear quietly." I closed my eyes, picturing Grace hunched over in some lawyer's office, plotting how to minimize her losses. For years, I had given in to her pleas, her excuses, her tears. But not this time. "Tell them I'll consider it," I said, "but only if the settlement includes a full confession in writing and made public. They'll admit I am competent. They'll admit every lie. And they'll clear my name where they smeared it." Harris's chuckle carried approval. "Sharp move, Miss Elaine. You're not just fighting back, you're reclaiming your reputation." As I hung up, I looked at my mother's letter one more time, then slid it into a frame. I placed it on the mantel where everyone who entered my home could see it. Not as a relic of the past, but as a promise for my future. The smear campaign had nearly broken me, but my mother's words stitched me back together, stronger than before. I was no longer the trembling woman replaying a voicemail in disbelief. I was a mother reclaiming her dignity. And soon, everyone, Grace, Daniel, the neighbors, the whole community, would see the truth in broad daylight. The courthouse smelled faintly of polish and paper, its high ceilings echoing with the shuffle of lawyers and families waiting for their hearings. I sat beside Attorney Harris, my crimson suit crisp, my mother's framed letter tucked safely into my bag like a shield. Across the table sat Grace and Daniel with their attorneys, both of them looking older, smaller, and far less confident than the smug couple who once plotted in my kitchen. Grace wouldn't meet my eyes. Her hands twisted in her lap, fingers pulling at her wedding ring as though it burned. Daniel scowled at the floor, jaw tight, a muscle twitching near his temple. Their attorney cleared his throat. "My clients are prepared to settle. They'll return the stolen funds, cover damages, and agree to no further contact." Harris leaned forward, voice calm but cutting. "That's not enough. Miss Miller has endured public humiliation. She demands a full confession, signed and notarized, that will be published in the same community spaces where they smeared her reputation. The statement must admit she is mentally competent and that all previous accusations were lies." A murmur rippled across the table. Grace's face crumpled. "Mom, please, don't make us do this in public. Everyone will know." I looked straight at her, my voice steady. "That's the point. You tried to destroy me publicly. You will clear my name publicly." For hours, negotiations dragged on. Their lawyer tried to argue for softer wording, for confidentiality clauses, for anything that might dull the blow. Harris held firm, and so did I. Finally, they caved. Grace's hand shook as she signed her name at the bottom of the confession. Daniel's signature followed, his lips pressed into a thin line. 2 weeks later, the statement appeared everywhere on the same Facebook groups where they had spread their lies, in the local paper, even pinned to the community board at the supermarket. We, Grace Miller and Daniel Miller, admit that we falsely accused Elaine Miller of suffering from dementia. We admit that we attempted to forge documents, transfer her property without consent, and exploit her financially. Elaine Miller is fully competent, and our actions were motivated by greed and desperation. We apologize publicly and accept full responsibility for the harm caused. The words were stark, undeniable. For the first time since this nightmare began, the whispers in the grocery store turned into nods of respect. Neighbors stopped me on my porch to say, "We always knew you weren't what they claimed." Miss Rose hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. "I'm so glad the truth is out, Elaine. I never doubted you." Financial restitution followed. They repaid the $25,000 I had given them, plus $15,000 in damages. Harris arranged for the funds to be deposited into the new account Grace didn't know about. But the money wasn't what mattered. What mattered was standing in line at the pharmacy and hearing 2 women whisper, "That poor woman was telling the truth all along," instead of, "She's losing her mind." What mattered was looking at myself in the mirror and seeing not a victim but a survivor. Grace tried one last time to appeal to me privately. She came to my door late one evening, her eyes red-rimmed, clutching a letter. "Mom, please, can we talk? I know I've done terrible things, but we've already lost everything. Isn't that punishment enough?" I opened the door only. Halfway, the chain still latched. My voice was quiet but firm. "Grace, consequences aren't punishment. They're the price of choices. You chose betrayal. Now you live with what follows." She broke down in tears, begging, but I closed the door gently and leaned against it, letting the weight of her sobs fade into silence. That night, I slept with the window open, cool air washing through my room. For the first time in years, I felt truly clean, my name restored, my dignity intact, and my power returned. The settlement wasn't just a victory in court. It was a declaration to the world. I was still here. I was still strong. And I would never again allow anyone, blood or not, to write me out of my own life. The ink on the settlement was barely dry when I realized I didn't want to live another day in the house where my daughter had plotted my downfall. Every wall held memories, but they were tainted now, Grace whispering in the kitchen with Kayla, Daniel pacing in the backyard on hushed phone calls, the feeling of being a stranger in my own home. It wasn't safety anymore. It was a battlefield scarred with betrayal. So I made a choice. With Harris's help, I listed the house and sold it within weeks. The profit, combined with the restitution, gave me enough to buy a modest apartment in a senior living community nearby. The building was bright and filled with gardens, neighbors who waved in the hallways, and a sense of dignity I hadn't felt in years. My new kitchen was small but perfect, with sunlight streaming across the counters every morning. For the first time, the air smelled like freedom. But my story didn't end with escape. Revenge, real revenge, was never about shouting or striking back. It was about letting the truth bleed into every corner of their lives until they had no place left to hide. During Harris's investigation, we uncovered more than Grace and Daniel's schemes. Their taxes didn't match their lifestyle. Bank records showed unreported income from Daniel's side jobs and Grace's online sales. Harris leaned back in his chair, a glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. "The IRS will be very interested in this." And they were. A month later, Grace and Daniel were hit with a $36,000 bill in back taxes, penalties, and interest. Their car disappeared from the driveway. Their jewelry was pawned. They moved into a cramped apartment across town, their once polished image stripped away. Grace's job suffered too. When her employer read the public confession, she was demoted, her path to promotion cut off. Daniel lost out on a management position after his boss asked the same question my lawyer had posed. "If you can defraud your own mother-in-law, why should we trust you with company money?" Their circle of friends evaporated. I heard whispers in the supermarket. "That's them, the couple who tried to steal from her." Invitations to parties, barbecues, church socials vanished. Even extended family turned cold. Daniel's sister told me later, "I couldn't even look at him after what he did. We were raised better than that." And Kayla? She resigned quietly, but not before her role became part of a bigger investigation. 6 county employees were fired after it was discovered they'd helped facilitate similar schemes. Grace and Daniel's betrayal had inadvertently pulled the curtain back on a whole network of corruption. For once, my pain had sparked something larger than myself. But the sweetest revenge wasn't the audits, the demotions, or the firings. It was the way people looked at me now. At the market, neighbors who once whispered doubts now touched my arm and said, "You're an inspiration." At church, women in my age group whispered, "You gave me courage to stand up to my own children." At the senior center, younger volunteers asked me to speak to their groups about protecting assets and dignity. I had become, without meaning to, a voice for women. Like me, women who had given everything to their families only to be discarded like old shoes. My story wasn't just mine anymore. It was a warning, a battle cry, and a promise that we were not powerless. Grace once tried to convince the world that I was confused, frail, incompetent. Now the truth was written in public records, tax audits, and newspaper headlines. She wanted to erase me. Instead, I had carved my story into stone. And every time I walked into my sunny apartment, greeted by neighbors who respected me, I whispered to myself, "This is the real revenge. Living with dignity. Living free." A year after the settlement, I woke to the sound of birdsong outside my balcony window. The morning sun spilled across the little apartment. I had made my own paintings I'd done in class, hung on the walls, a quilt folded across the armchair, a vase of fresh daisies on the table. My life was simple, but it was mine, and it pulsed with a kind of peace I hadn't felt in decades. The senior living community had become more than just a home. It was a family I chose. We shared potluck dinners in the garden, swapped stories in the common room, and even took line dancing classes in the evenings. For the first time in years, I laughed without checking to see if someone was laughing at me. But my deepest fulfillment came from the Golden Hope Foundation, the very group I'd named as my beneficiary. 3 days a week I volunteered there, sitting with seniors who had been swindled or abandoned by their families. Their stories mirrored mine, bank accounts drained by sons, houses stolen by nieces, wills manipulated by cousins. I would listen, take their trembling hands in mine, and tell them, "You are not crazy. You are not weak. You are not alone." Slowly, I became known as the woman who fought back and won. Reporters came once, writing an article titled, "Mother Outsmarts Daughter's Betrayal." My neighbors clipped it and tacked it to the bulletin board in the crit lobby. For me, though, the real reward was the quiet moments watching another senior straighten her shoulders after hearing my story, realizing she, too, could take back her life. Grace tried once more to reach me. A letter slipped under my apartment door one rainy evening, her handwriting uneven. "Mom, I know I don't deserve forgiveness. Therapy has opened my eyes. I was selfish, greedy, blind to the woman who gave me everything. Not a day passes that I don't regret what I did. I'm not asking to be part of your life, only for you to know that I finally see the harm I caused." I sat with that letter for hours. My chest ached with sorrow, but also with clarity. I wrote back a short reply. "Grace, I forgive you because holding anger will only poison me. But forgiveness is not forgetting, and it is not reconciliation. My life is at peace without you, and I intend to keep it that way. I hope you find your own peace, far from me." I sealed the envelope and felt the weight lift. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't victory. It was closure. Now, when I look in the mirror, I no longer see the exhausted house cleaner who once sacrificed herself to the last penny. I see a woman with steady eyes and a spine straightened by hard-earned self-respect. At 67, I learned that family isn't defined by blood, but by love. That dignity is not something you beg for, it is something you claim. And that even when betrayal slices deepest, healing is possible if you fight for it. One evening, as I painted a sunset from memory, my neighbor Nora clinked a glass of wine against mine and said, "Elaine, you could have given up. But instead, you wrote a whole new chapter." I smiled, setting down my brush. "That's the thing about life, Nora. It's never too late to choose how your story ends." And as the room filled with the soft hum of conversation and laughter, I knew mine would end with peace, with dignity, and with the quiet triumph of a woman who had finally learned she was enough.